They call it 23 hours. A cell the size of a closet. Light that never truly goes out. In the remote deserts and mountains of America, Supermax prisons lock away men so dangerous the system says they cannot mix with anyone else, and then spends decades watching what that isolation does to the human mind. This is 23 Hours Alone. The truth about America's Supermax prison. What is a Supermax? The architecture of solitary. If you've seen images of concrete boxes, metal bars, and razor wire, you've already pictured a Supermax, but the real story is less cinematic and far more chilling. A supermaximum or Supermax prison is not just a stronger fence or a tougher lock. It is a distinct philosophy translated directly into architecture. Across the United States, Supermax units were designed to hold the most dangerous, most violent, most unmanageable inmates, people whose presence in a general population dormitory was judged too risky. Those units are defined by one brutal statistic: up to 23 hours a day in single-cell confinement with minimal human contact. That definition, reinforced by federal and academic reports, is not metaphor. It is the daily reality for hundreds, sometimes thousands, of people. Office of Justice Programs. How did we get here? The Supermax model exploded in the 1980s and 1990s as corrections departments responded to riots, staff murders, and the rising power of organized gangs inside prisons. Administrators argued, if a handful of inmates could destabilize an entire facility, isolate them and you isolate the problem. The result was a new generation of prisons and housing units built specifically to deny contact. Sound-suppressing cells, remote-controlled doors, tiny slit windows, concrete beds and desk units, and recreation yards the size of a dog run. The physical design enforces a philosophy: containment above everything else. That containment is precise and often clinical. A typical Supermax cell, the kind you hear described in news features and first-person letters, will measure roughly 7 by 12 feet. It contains a concrete bed, a stainless steel sink/toilet, a small built-in desk, and a narrow slot in the door for food trays. Windows are little more than narrow slits, angled so that an inmate can see only a slice of sky, never the horizon. For almost all senses, the world is reduced to the hum of HVAC, a single overhead light, and the occasional scraping of keys. Official inspection reports repeatedly note the same facts. These units aim to prevent coordinated violence by removing opportunities for communication. CIC.dc.gov. The canonical example in the federal system is ADX Florence in Colorado, the Supermax of Supermaxes. Built after a series of deadly incidents in other federal prisons, ADX opened in 1995 as a unit expressly for inmates who were violent, escape-prone, or so powerful inside prisoner hierarchies that the Bureau of Prisons believed they could not be safely managed elsewhere. It is the place that houses terrorists, notorious gang leaders, and those who have murdered correctional staff. The roster of past and present ADX inmates reads like a who's who of modern criminal infamy, a fact the Bureau and journalists have both repeatedly documented. Wikipedia. But there's a paradox at the center of the Supermax experiment. The philosophy is simple: reduce interactions, reduce risk. Yet decades of research, legal filings, and first-hand testimony show that prolonged isolation produces predictable harms: hallucinations, severe anxiety, paranoia, self-harm, and suicidality among them. The clinical literature and prison advocacy reports have long linked prolonged solitary to dramatic declines in mental health, and the rule of thumb among researchers is grim. Solitary damages minds in a way that the cell door cannot protect the institution from. PMC. That tension, containment versus human cost, is not theoretical. It reached a courtroom in the case known as Cunningham versus Federal Bureau of Prisons, a class action filed by ADX inmates alleging that the Bureau failed to properly diagnose and treat serious mental illness and that keeping severely mentally ill people in the Supermax environment violated the Eighth Amendment. The litigation, which progressed through discovery and settlement negotiations, produced reforms: more mental health screenings, limits on psychotropic prescriptions in certain control units, and the transfer of many seriously ill men out of ADX into treatment facilities. The case highlighted an uncomfortable truth: the same system that builds the box doesn't always build the care to keep the human inside it alive. Clearinghouse.net. The Supermax model also exists outside Florence. State systems, from Marion to Red Onion, from Pelican Bay to the modern, restrictive housing units, adapted the design to local needs. Academic studies and federal reports show that as many as tens of thousands of people in the U.S. experience restrictive housing at any given time, often for reasons that can range from violent behavior to minor rule violations. What's constant is the regimen. Most solitary placements involve near total isolation, removed social structure, and a sentence measured in months or years rather than days. Office of Justice Programs. So when we talk about 23 hours alone, we are not indulging in hyperbole. We are describing a policy and built environment that makes solitude the primary instrument of correction. The question this film will follow is simple and urgent. What does that policy do to the people we lock away, the staff who work inside the machines we built, and to the idea of justice itself? In the next chapter we step inside one such box, through the narrow slot of a cell door, into the daily life of someone sentenced to 23 hours alone, and listen for the sounds that remain. A day behind the door. Living 23 hours alone. For most of us, a day lasts 24 hours. For them, it's 23. The other hour is called freedom, but even that comes with walls. The routine. Inside a Supermax like ADX Florence, every second of an inmate's day is choreographed. The Bureau of Prisons calls it highly structured housing. Prisoners call it something else, the box. They wake up not by alarm, but by light. Fluorescent fixtures flicking on automatically around 5 a.m. There's no knock on the door, no count time in the usual sense, because the count never stops. Cameras are fixed on every hallway, motion sensors monitor each cell, and guards perform visual checks every 30 minutes through reinforced glass. Breakfast arrives through the feeding slot, a metal flap barely wide enough for a tray. The officer slides it in, sometimes without a word. Oatmeal. Powdered milk. A banana if it's a good day. The inmate eats alone, seated on a concrete stool fixed to the floor. When the tray goes out, silence returns. Communication through steel. In ADX and other Supermaxes, cells are soundproofed by design. The Bureau's architects wanted to eliminate the clang and chaos of traditional prisons, the yelling through vents, the banging on pipes, the passing of contraband notes. The result, a near-total sensory void. Some prisoners tap on walls in code, others shout into the toilet bowl, flushing water to make a crude speaker so sound can travel through pipes. It's primitive, but in a place like this, it's survival. Former inmate Thomas Silverstein, who spent over 3 decades in solitary after killing a guard at Marion, once wrote, "You learn to talk to yourself. After a while, you stop knowing if you're answering back." Psychologists who've studied long-term isolation note that the mind starts to compensate, inventing stimulation when it can't find any. Patterns in the concrete become faces. The hiss of ventilation sounds like whispers. Days blur together. The 1 hour. Every 24 hours, inmates at ADX get a single hour outside the cell, the only time they're allowed in open air. But outside is relative. They are shackled at wrists and ankles, escorted by 2 guards through multiple remote-controlled steel doors, and brought to what's called the recreation pen, a small concrete enclosure roughly the size of a single-car garage. Some have mesh ceilings instead of open sky. Some, at newer facilities, have solid concrete roofs with small holes drilled for light. There's no grass, no view, no sound except the wind. That hour, for many, becomes the most psychologically torturous part of the day, a glimpse of what they can't have. "When you stand in that cage," wrote one inmate in a 2014 letter, "you can smell rain, but you can't feel it." When the hour ends, the ritual reverses. Cuffs on, escort back, door lock, silence. Medical visits and showers. Once or twice a week, an inmate may leave his cell for a shower. Even that takes full restraints. Officers escort the inmate to a stall secured behind a locked gate. The water runs for 10 minutes. The showerhead is tamper-proof. There are no mirrors. No interaction with others. Medical appointments happen through the same barrier. Staff talk through glass, using intercoms. The term contact visit doesn't apply here. There is no physical contact, ever. Even the mail, one of the few lifelines, is censored, scanned, and delayed for weeks. Many letters arrive blacked out, their sentences shredded by black marker. Inmates describe waiting for months to hear a single word from the outside world. Mind games and meltdowns. For prison psychologists, Supermax facilities are a paradox. They are built to prevent violence, yet they create conditions that can trigger it internally. According to a 2017 Yale Law School report, prolonged isolation correlates strongly with hallucinations, panic attacks, and suicidal ideation. One ADX inmate wrote in a legal filing, "I dream of doors. Every night. I open them, but there's always another behind it." Another, transferred after a breakdown, had spent 14 years in near-total isolation. His medical record listed severe depression, auditory hallucinations, and self-inflicted injuries. Former ADX warden Robert Hood, who oversaw the facility from 2002 to 2005, once admitted, "This isn't built for rehabilitation. It's built for control. And after a while, control becomes cruelty." The guard's perspective. Correctional officers rarely talk about the emotional toll, but former staff describe the environment as claustrophobic on both sides of the door. Guards undergo routine psychological evaluations, but burnout rates remain high. The stress of constant surveillance, minimal interaction, and the responsibility of containing high-profile inmates turns every shift into psychological warfare. One retired officer recalled, "You can't show weakness. You can't even look tired. These guys study every move. But the silence, that gets to you. You start to feel like the walls are watching you too." Some staff cope with dark humor. Others transfer out within a few years. A few, like Warden Hood, speak openly now, saying ADX Florence made them question the very purpose of incarceration. Letters from inside. Between 2012 and 2020, journalists from the New York Times, the Marshall Project, and Solitary Watch obtained dozens of letters from ADX inmates. The writing is surprisingly poetic, often meticulous, as if each word is a defiance against decay. One man serving a life sentence wrote, "I count cracks in the floor. There are 486. Sometimes they change. I know they don't, but it helps to pretend they do." Another described memorizing the sound of the guard's boots. "You can tell who's on shift by the rhythm of their walk. That's how you know time is still moving." The smallest human cues, a footstep, a voice, a shadow, become evidence of existence. The long sentence of silence. For most inmates in Supermax custody, there is no clear release date from isolation. Some graduate out after years of perfect behavior, transferred back to less restrictive units. Others die there, of age, illness, or self-inflicted wounds. Psychiatrists call it the long sentence of silence. A punishment that doesn't just remove freedom, it erases sound, touch, and belonging. And yet, every day, the system continues. Lights on at 5. Trays at 6. Count at 7. 23 hours in a concrete room. 1 hour in another concrete room. The human mind wasn't built for that, but it adapts, or it collapses. The mind becomes the cell. You can lock a man's body away, but when you lock his mind, something inside both prisoner and prison begins to break. Inside the human experiment. In 2014, Dr. Stuart Gracian, a psychiatrist who has evaluated hundreds of inmates in isolation, testified before a federal court. His words were chilling. Prolonged solitary confinement can cause a specific psychiatric syndrome. It's not metaphor, it's neurological injury. He called it SHU syndrome, named after the Special Housing Unit, the solitary section in most federal prisons. Symptoms include hypersensitivity to noise and light, hallucinations and panic attacks, extreme lethargy or self-harm, cognitive decline so severe that inmates forget words mid-sentence. At ADX Florence, inmates have written of seeing faces in concrete, hearing phantom voices whispering through vents, and forgetting what their own voices sound like. One prisoner, in a letter leaked to the Marshall Project, wrote, "The silence isn't quiet. It's screaming. The lawsuits that shook the walls." The pressure to reform Supermax prisons reached a boiling point in 2012, when several inmates at ADX, including mentally ill prisoners, filed a lawsuit against the Bureau of Prisons. Baycoat vs. Federal Bureau of Prisons. The lawsuit alleged inhumane treatment and deliberate indifference toward mentally ill inmates held in isolation. Court filings described men smearing blood on walls, cutting themselves with razor fragments, and screaming for hours, often ignored by guards. The case exposed a disturbing truth. Many prisoners at ADX were never meant to be there. They weren't terrorists or gang leaders, they were inmates with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or severe PTSD, placed in an environment scientifically proven to make them worse. One of the plaintiffs, known only as Inmate X, had tried to hang himself 3 times. Another mutilated himself with a paperclip. The suit documented over 100 self-harm incidents in a single year. Under mounting legal and public pressure, the Bureau quietly began transferring mentally ill inmates out of ADX to a new facility in North Carolina, the ADX Mental Health Unit at Butner. But the core issue remained: America still had over 80,000 people in some form of solitary confinement. The human cost. To understand the human toll, you have to listen to those who've lived it. Anthony Graves, a wrongfully convicted man who spent 18 years in isolation on Texas death row, once said, "Solitary confinement breaks a man's will to live. I watched strong men beg for death." Psychologists who've studied post-isolation trauma say the effects resemble hostage syndrome or torture survivors. Released inmates often struggle to speak in full sentences. Many can't stand crowds, flinch at sudden noises, and have no sense of time. When Robert King, one of the Angola 3, was freed after 29 years in solitary, he described walking into the sunlight as a physical pain. "The sun was too bright," he said. "I had to learn to be human again." Inside the warden's mind. Even those who enforce the system are haunted by it. Former ADX warden Robert Hood, who oversaw the prison during the early 2000s, later called it a clean version of hell. Hood admitted he tried to treat inmates with respect. Small gestures, like speaking through the intercom with empathy or ensuring mail wasn't unnecessarily delayed, but the system itself was designed to erase connection. "You can't run a place like that without it changing you," he said. "You go home and realize you're still counting doors in your head." Other wardens have defended Supermaxes as a necessary evil, housing men like Ted Kaczynski, El Chapo Guzman, and the Boston Marathon bomber, inmates who've proven dangerous even behind bars. But the moral question remains. At what point does safety become cruelty? The cost to society. Solitary confinement doesn't just damage individuals. It reshapes entire systems. Taxpayers spend nearly $78,000 per inmate per year in Supermax custody, roughly 3 times the cost of a general population prisoner. And the recidivism data is alarming. A study by the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that inmates released directly from solitary are twice as likely to reoffend within 3 years. Isolation doesn't reform, it disconnects. And when disconnected people re-enter society, the results can be catastrophic. The walls begin to crack. Public pressure, lawsuits, and international condemnation have slowly forced change. In 2016, President Obama banned solitary confinement for juveniles in federal prisons, calling it an affront to human dignity. Some states, Colorado, Maine, and Washington, have drastically reduced solitary use, with Colorado closing its last true Supermax unit in 2017. Even former correctional officers are speaking out. Rick Ramish, once head of Colorado's Department of Corrections, famously spent a night in solitary himself, 20 hours of silence, and emerged shaken. "I lasted 1 night," he said. "Imagine 1 year. Or 10. The world watches." Globally, the UN has declared more than 15 days of solitary confinement a form of torture. Yet in the United States, thousands remain locked up for years, even decades. The irony: the most advanced nation on Earth maintains the most psychologically regressive form of incarceration still in existence. ADX Florence, the Alcatraz of the Rockies, stands as a symbol of ultimate control. A fortress so secure that no one has ever escaped. And yet, countless minds have escaped within it, slipping into madness, despair, or silence. What freedom means after 23 hours alone. For most inmates here, the first sound they'll hear after decades of silence is the wind, on the day they die. Every wall, every lock, every fluorescent light at ADX was built to enforce control. But the story of Supermax prisons isn't just about walls. It's about what happens when a society begins to believe safety requires isolation. The truth is, solitary confinement doesn't stop violence. It contains it. It hides it. And in doing so, it multiplies it. Inside these walls are men who committed terrible crimes, but also men who never stood a chance at redemption. And outside these walls, the rest of us are left with the question: if punishment destroys the mind, is it still justice? 23 hours alone. 1 hour of air. That's the price of America's idea of control. But the question we must all ask is, how much of our own humanity are we willing to lock away with them? Solitary confinement, torture or necessity? Tell us what you think in the comments.